in which case I'd like to say a very warm welcome to Hughes Hall. My name's Stephen Axford. I'm a fellow at Hughes Hall and Director of Strategy and the Bridge. And I think it's absolutely wonderful that despite the fact we have the ongoing crisis all around us, we still want to provide the sort of opportunities for you and your colleagues that you would expect of, an exciting Cambridge academic environment. So talks and debates and the chance for everybody to get involved. Thank you in particular for tonight for registering and joining us. And please do be aware of all the other events that Hughes Hall has to offer. There's quite a lot going on, and our website does have very up-to-date information about all our events. I'd also like to thank our speakers in advance, in case I forget to do it later, who have prepared some really quite insightful and fascinating material for all of us to think about. It's great to see so many people here from across Cambridge, not just from the college, as well as many of our own students and senior members. I mentioned the word the bridge a moment ago. This talk and this whole series and many other talks going on at the college is being done under the auspices of what we call the bridge at Hughes Hall, which in a way does exactly what it says in the tin. It's designed to bridge the academic and the wider world, particularly connecting and enabling researchers and their research-based knowledge to have a real impact in the world. So looking way beyond universities and the academic community into areas like public policy, business, the professions, and so on. It's something that we're very proud of, something that is, I think, unique in the Cambridge ecosystem, but it's very early days, and we're hoping that many of you will take an ongoing interest in what we have to do. One of the major themes of the bridge is global health and well-being, led by one of our life fellows, Professor Nabila Farah, formerly head of the pathology department, which clearly is very pertinent in the current times. And it was under the thinking about global health and well-being that we decided that a series of seminars on the way that COVID is impacting different sectors of the economy would be something that would be worth exploring. So we will have a talk in a few weeks' time on education, one next week on law and governance and the way institutions are responding to COVID. We have tonight's, of course, and last week we had one on how medical education and training is being affected very much as it happens during the pandemic. This whole series, therefore, is designed to collect some insight and work towards a synthesis from all the events via more discussions next term, probably working towards a form of report that can then stimulate new research and interest, new research questions and activity, and perhaps inform wider policy making that take us beyond the current crisis and into a world beyond COVID. As to how we will run tonight, there will be some short opening presentations from our five perhaps speakers. There are two on one topic. That will last for probably just under half an hour, probably more like 25 minutes. We will then put you all fairly randomly into 4 different breakout groups, each run by the 4 speakers, where you'll have a chance to discuss what you've heard and think about addressing 1 or 2 key questions. And then within each breakout, there is a identified reporter who will make themselves known in your group. And we will then feed that back to the plenary about half an hour after that. So we will then hear what has been going on and see what sort of conclusions we can start to draw. And we will definitely finish by 7:30 because we don't like to overrun. We do hope you'll take the opportunity to pick up some new ideas, and we really want to hear from you. Don't let this be a chance, only an opportunity for you to listen to others. Please do tell us what you think when you hear things being discussed. The breakout sessions are the place where we can capture that, and we do need your input, so get stuck in. The speakers want challenge and insight, at least that's what I'm telling them they want, so they do. And we can develop all the thinking again later as well after the event. If you wish to talk to any of us afterwards, please do keep in touch. We don't want to lose contact with you. And although it's not as easy as keeping in touch over a drink and a nibble, if it's for a real event, there are ways of doing it, and we shouldn't neglect the chances to keep talking. So tonight we have 5 speakers. They're all senior members of Hughes Hall from a variety of departments. We have Arjit Ajay Palikad from engineering. We have Michael Barrett and Carl Prince from the Judge Business School. We have Tamea Nokta from the engineering department, and we have Ian Hodge from land economy. I won't say any more about them because they can explain their interests as we go on. And therefore, without any more delay, we begin with Ajay and a focus on resilience and decentralization in infrastructure businesses. I think the factors resilience and decentralization will be a common theme through tonight's talks. And I am now going to attempt to share the slides with you. However, I'm not feeling this. Yet share screen. I will find the right thing. This is where IT, or rather me, fails. Okay. Jeff, does that work?
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Stephen.
So that's the title page, which I think I've already mentioned all your names. So I will now go page down. Does this work? There we are.
Great, thank you. So just to introduce myself first, my name is Ajay Palikad. I'm a reader in asset management at the Department of Engineering. My key interest from a research point of view is to look at how data and digital technologies can be used to improve the way in which we manage our industrial and infrastructure systems. So I look at things like data analytics, machine learning, artificial intelligence, and so on to carry out predictive maintenance on industrial equipment and so on and so forth. So what I thought we will do is because over the next four theme introductions, including myself, we'll be touching upon these two issues of resilience and decentralization. So I thought I'll start off by just giving a couple of words about what resilience and decentralization means in this context. These four discussions, as Stephen mentioned, not meant to be a teaching session or an exhaustive presentation on the topic. It's just meant to seed some thoughts in your mind, which you can then carry through to the breakout sessions for further discussion. So first off, resilience, what does that mean? So in a sense, resilience is the ability of an organization to withstand any disruptions and to be able to recover from those disruptions very quickly, as quickly as possible. So if you look at the graph on the left-hand side, when on the y-axis we have some measure of performance, and when a disruption happens, obviously there will be a drop in performance. A resilient organization's objective is to reduce the amount of drop that happens when a disruption happens, and of course, reduce the time taken to recover from such a disruption. The hope is that instead of a partial recovery, you would go back to full performance or even a better level of performance when you recover from that disruption. So obviously in the world of COVID and so on, we do talk about resilience in various contexts, in the context of infrastructure, in the context of our healthcare systems, and so on and so forth, which we'll hear over the next half an hour or so. The other major context issue that we will discuss is the issue of decentralization. So a centralized structure, for example, in most organizations, we have a centralized structure, we have a centralized authority, both in terms of location as well as in terms of managerial structures. And increasingly, especially with COVID, with people working from home and so on, we are evolving into a decentralized way of working and decentralized way of managing systems and businesses. Now, they both are related. People say that decentralization kind of has a very strong link to resilience. On one hand, a centralized structure will have more more command and control authority that might help with resilience. However, centralized structures often have a single point of failure as well, which decentralization might help in terms of the ability to recover from any disruptions. So I'll stop the introduction there and go into the topic that I will be discussing, which is Stephen. Next slide. I was trying to change the slide by clicking here, but I forgot that you have the control. Uh, so in terms of COVID and its impact on infrastructure from a resilience point of view, so all infrastructure companies or all organizations typically will have their plans in place for business continuity, to plans in place to recover from any major disruptions. Um, Typically these days, the emerging thinking is to think about climate change related issues, major weather events, and so on when it comes to business continuity planning. Very few, if not no, organizations might have actually considered a pandemic, or at least a pandemic of this scale in their continuity planning. So as we have seen across all sectors, and this applies to infrastructure as well, the effect of COVID has been immense in infrastructure companies' ability to carry on their day-to-day business, in terms of coping with disruptions, regular disruptions or major disruptions, but also in general their own business survival and so on as well. Now, one of the key things that really affects the ability to respond to disruptions is with COVID is staff absence due to the disease itself, but also other things like social distancing and so on that has to be put in place in the organization, which means that, say, for example, if there is a major weather event. So this happened in Connecticut. One of our PhD students, Sally, who is actually within our audience, picked this up a couple of days ago. In Connecticut, when the storm Isaias happened in, I think, September, or in the summer, I think, late summer. Their ability to go out to the site and fix the things that have failed due to the storm was severely affected because of staff not being available at hand to go and fix things, social distancing regulations that had to be put in place, which means that the large teams of people that normally are required to do these kind of activities, we can't do it in a socially distanced manner. So all of that had a negative impact in them being able to recover well, in this case, electricity to their customers. So around 800,000 customers were affected in that case. There is also a discussion about how digital technologies can help improve the resilience of organizations. So we've seen that now it is debatable how effective this is, but with our COVID track and trace app and so on, we've seen how data and digital technologies can help understand the way in which the disease is evolving over in the community. And the same kind of things and same kind of analysis can be applied at an organizational level as well to really understand the impact of such pandemics in their ability to carry on with their business. On the other hand, from a decentralization point of view, customers of infrastructure organizations, which are consumers like ourselves, the nature of work is changing within the organization, but also within their customers as well. So we have all started working from home. So the question is the infrastructure actually designed to support this? If you think about the telecoms infrastructure, is the telecoms infrastructure designed to have heavy video streaming all across the country at homes throughout the weekdays? Typically, a telecoms infrastructure would be designed with big, huge data pipelines or bandwidth available to big companies to transfer data and so on, not for individual customers. And the same applies to electricity networks and other kinds of infrastructure networks as well. The people's locations are changing, and is it actually designed to do this? In going into the future, how can we actually build an adaptable and reconfigurable infrastructure? So when such a thing happens in the future, companies can cope with the changing nature of consumption, changing nature of work, and so on. And in terms of future investment, should infrastructure companies use this window of opportunity that should say for a reset in terms of thinking about the way in which the infrastructure is being used by people. I talked about telecom infrastructure, and same applies to transportation infrastructure as well. When it comes to future investment, should we actually think that this is going to be the new norm and plan and prepare for this new norm when it comes to investing in infrastructure? I'll stop there. Oh yes, one more slide just to highlight what we are going to discuss in the discussion session. So the discussion theme will be really asking ourselves the question and sharing our thoughts on how can infrastructure companies prepare in the future to improve their resilience against future pandemics. We don't actually need to think far ahead. It's not just future pandemics, future waves of COVID-19 as well. Thanks, Stephen. You're on mute.
Sorry, the classic trick of not knowing you're muted. Thank you very much, Ajit. That was great. I'm not going to risk unsharing the screen because it could all go horribly wrong. So I think that we will move swiftly on to the next topic, which is with Michael and Carl, and ask them to kick off. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. So my name is Michael Barrett, and I'm going to be, as Stephen mentioned, presenting the discussion around telemedicine services and the way in which we've seen an acceleration of that during COVID, and what the implications might be for the future of hospital design. I'm doing this with Carl Prince, who's going to be leading the actual breakout session, which will follow this, and looking forward to some good discussion together. So following on from what Ajit mentioned in his presentation, we're going to pull through those themes of resilience and decentralization, which we are seeing as well in the healthcare sector quite significantly. And we've been sort of doing a number of studies looking at the somewhat unexpected acceleration of telemedicine services. And in one particular site that we were looking at, they went from 0 to 10,000. This was in ophthalmology. And the way in which they delivered it in quite non-traditional approaches and to how services have been configured, designed, and delivered typically. And so what we're keen to sort of look at is the whole notion of what the implications might be, if you like, beyond the pendulum swing for how we might design hospitals in the future. Some of you may know, but in the UK, certainly our Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, has pledged to build 40 new hospitals in 10 years, in the next 10 years. And so if we think about some of these issues which have been brought together and accelerated during COVID around telemedicine services, what might be the way in which we think about the porosity of our hospital walls and how we deliver service across the healthcare community. So on the left-hand side, just to highlight the way in which during COVID, the whole notion of resilience, we've seen it, the way in which COVID as a disruption has really made very visible the inequality in access to healthcare, and impacted quite disproportionately minority groups, for example, in terms of deaths. And it has at the same time, meaning COVID, expose the fragility around how and the risks embedded within how we traditionally design for care in hospitals, and how we need to think about the ability in these disruptive scenarios to deliver care in new ways. And so if we think about and how we consider resilience, very much as it has emerged, and we've seen it in the healthcare sector with COVID-19, as a crisis-driven agility, really, in responding to the healthcare needs. And we've suggested the notion of digital resilience, which picks up on Ajit's point on the increasing importance of digital and digital technologies. But the idea of how we then think about the designing, the deploying, and using of digital technologies to try to quickly recover from or adjust to those different major disruptions or crises that we are seeing in healthcare. And on the right-hand side, the decentralization in healthcare provision, digital technologies around telemedicine and remote monitoring provide that resilience to offer a decentralized set of services. And what we're seeing and what's critical going forward is how do we both develop and manage hybrid models of providing what in some cases might have been more traditional physical care, let's say around the ICU, which has always been extremely important for personal contact, which will still maintain or be retained, but how we also need to, if we're going to introduce, as you'll see in a minute, telemedicine to support areas such as ICUs, then how do we ensure that you have a hybrid model of virtual and physical care? And so what we're seeing is that when you, if you like, expand that thinking more widely to other parts of the hospital and other parts of the health ecosystem, there's an increasing requirement for flexible design to support the agility which we need to have in times of crisis. And we're seeing that together then the provision of using digital technologies to provide and innovate services is having a significant impact on how we think about transforming hospital design and how we can accelerate and think about both the digital transformation of hospitals, but also how that connects into the community, to how the interfaces with clinics and other parts of the ecosystem, including pharmacies, for example. Next slide, please, Stephen. And so this, what we're just showing here is what's interesting around the telemedicine, which has been around for a long time, a few decades, but as I mentioned at the beginning, has had very little take up in certain services, but most of the work has been in, for example, home care, in using telemedicine to support care in the community. What we're seeing with COVID was the way in which telemedicine is used to support outpatients, as well as, interestingly, within intensive care itself, where the need for contactless care has been significantly increased. Next slide, please, Stephen. And so here's an example of what we're seeing in one hospital that we looked at as the way in which, telemedicine, this is within the ICU area, where they've set up a glass divider, which now allows for remote care from within, or where you see the screens. But what we're also seeing is a significant ramp up, if you like, of different digital technologies, such as what you can see there in the middle screen is what's called an in-touch telepresence robot, which allows you can move around and visit the patients and broadcast the actual face of the medic who's in the control room behind that glass divider on the left-hand side of the screen. And we're all very familiar now, perhaps, with on the right-hand side of the screen, the PPE, protective gear, which are needed to be there right with the patients in the actual ICU. But what we're seeing then is this sort of new emergent physical connections which are separating what have traditionally been, a single space for an ICU, and having virtual connections through these different digital technologies, which, of course, as we know, is particularly important given the need to protect medical personnel from infection and also to provide continued support, business continuity, that, as you mentioned, for patients coming in and often overloading ICUs. Next slide, please. And so what we want to look at, Carl and I, in the breakout, would be to explore this theme around the growth of telemedicine and remote monitoring services, following what we call the pendulum swing of the COVID-19 pandemic, how that's going to be related to new ways of delivering service and what the implications might be for how Boris thinks about these 40 new hospitals over the next 10 years. Thank you.
Michael, thank you very much for that. and we look forward to that discussion. I think we should just move swiftly on to Tamea, and who will be looking at cities.
Yes, thank you, Stephen. So maybe just let me introduce myself quickly. My name is Tima Nokta. I'm a research associate in urban systems at the Center for Smart Infrastructure and Construction at the Department of Engineering. And I'm also a research fellow at Hughes Hall. And my research interests generally revolve around urban governance and policy, and particularly around infrastructures and digitalization. So this was the background in which I considered the issue of COVID-19 and the pandemic and its effects. So looking at the crisis that the pandemic has caused in cities, in terms of resilience, obviously it highlighted the health impacts, and that includes both physical health as well as mental health of actually unsustainable urbanization. So one aspect of that is air pollution related to specifically to traffic patterns and congestion that are features of actually most cities around the globe. It highlighted the lack of green spaces and green infrastructure, and especially access to green spaces and green infrastructure more or less depending on which areas of the cities are we talking about. And that had implications for mental health specifically. And also it highlighted the high reliance of cities and urbanization, contemporary urbanization, on global flows of people, goods, capital, and information. And so what has been then the impact of all these characteristics in terms of decentralization? Is it actually leading to the death of the city, which many journalists have been claiming recently? And a lot of these reports actually depict an exodus from dense urban areas, both for living. So I think there are statistics about how housing prices in urban areas are rising due to people working from home, being able to work from home, but also needing more space to work from home and living small urban apartments, and also for working. So an example of that is obviously with the closure of offices and office spaces, that had an impact on hospitality jobs around central urban areas. And a lot of these hospitality workers or cleaning sector, these kind of workers are actually now commuting out from London, looking for work elsewhere with the relocation of those needs. And of course, working from home led to the idea of the death of the center business district as well. That results in empty offices in traditional urban centers. But also in the need of space for home working at homes, and also a need for connectivity and the infrastructure that supports that connectivity that Ajit has mentioned previously. There is an issue around public transport in cities. So how public transport is actually struggling to take up. Car use is rising in urban areas, which has been a trend which is a trend that is actually new. So there was quite a bit of an agreement that we have reached peak car, and now car use is going to go down. But actually what we see in many places is that after COVID, car use is rising. People are not using public transport. TfL needed millions of pounds of bailout recently. And so the question is whether these decentralization patterns, will those lead to unmitigated urban sprawl, as they did for example, in the US a couple of decades ago, or will they lead to connected towns, which is an idea that has been proposed, for example, by the Garden City movement as well. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. And so just to explore these issues, obviously there are a lot of things that can be said about it, but one of the interesting ideas that this situation actually brought up again is this idea of the 15 or 20-minute city, which is not a new idea. It's essentially a response to unsustainable urbanization patterns. And what it means is can be broadly aggregated into 4 core principles. So these include easy access to services, for example, healthcare or education, and goods, so for example, food at the neighborhood scale. It includes more localized economies and easy access to jobs and workplaces, again on the neighborhood scale. It includes diverse housing options to enable more people to live closer to where they work, and also includes good air quality, which actually has two components. So one around traffic management and just generally a different kind of traffic that we are, or transport that we are used to, and also an accessibility of green infrastructure. We can move forward, I think. So we will explore, or we will try to explore many of the issues that link into the 15-minute city idea. And if we go to the next slide, that will show the discussion theme that I wanted to talk about. So as I mentioned, the 15-minute city is not exactly a new idea as such, but what is different is how ICTs and data can actually have a huge role in facilitating these 15-minute cities and the connected villages rather than moving towards urban sprawl. So the question that we will be asking is actually how can data, digital tools, and smarter urban planning and management support this move towards more sustainable, so for example, 15-minute cities during and after the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mayor. And again, that will be, I think, a fascinating discussion. I think we have one more to go, which will be about the countryside. So we move outwards from the urban environment into the rural. And Ian, I think you're going to talk to us.
Good. Yeah. Thanks, Stephen. I'm Ian Hodge. I'm Emeritus Professor of Rural Economy, so I'm from the Department of Land Economy. I've worked over many years on and off on rural development, although I have to confess I haven't done much thinking about rural development in the past decade or so. When you get to my age, it's the odd decade here or there that matters. So what I thought I'd do is just reflect a little. This is, in a sense, a speculation. I think this is perhaps my excuse for this being less fluent than my colleagues' presentations. So I just wanted to think about the implications, and Tamir has really introduced the idea that we see decentralization, that actually what we are experiencing is a movement away from the center, and people talking about migration often talk in terms of push and pull factors. And it seems to me we can think about the higher rates and risks of COVID in a more densely settled area. And that will be an incentive, perhaps particularly for older people or maybe younger people with families to move away from the center. That under lockdown, if you're in a densely settled urban area, you probably can't afford a large property, and so you're likely to be in cramped conditions under lockdown. And I guess the thinking here is that we begin to recognize that the risk of something like this is higher in the future. Really, it's a perception of that risk rather than the actual risk that we are concerned with. And then I guess some of the implications, if people move away from urban areas, maybe there is less in the way of cultural attractions in the center, and less need to work in the city center. On the other hand, the obverse of that, in rural areas, we can think about more space, cheaper housing. Despite people tend to tell us that housing in rural areas is more expensive, it isn't per unit of housing. Less congestion in rural areas, better air quality. Maybe we are increasingly conscious of the implications of poor air quality in urban areas, and access to the countryside. And there is perhaps increasing attention to the importance of getting access to green space in terms of maintaining our mental health, particularly under lockdown. So what are the implications of that? So really the point is I want to think about what are the implications of a population decentralization. Back in the 1980s, we discovered the idea of counter-urbanization. So maybe we are about to embark on, if you like, a counter-urbanization too. And the question then is, what are the social implications of this shift, or what could be the social implications for communities in rural areas? So I guess I'm thinking of small towns and perhaps more dense or deeper countryside. So the implications already mentioned, perhaps higher house prices, but also a pressure for land for development. So if people start demanding larger houses in rural areas, then the pressure on our green space is likely to increase. What about the demand for infrastructure? If people are living and working in rural areas, then often the rather poor quality of the digital infrastructure in rural areas would need to be improved. But also, and we've talked about the healthcare already, but also for schools, for social facilities, as well as for businesses. And then perhaps if people are more focused on the areas in which they live, so maybe we think about, in the past, we've thought about decentralization often being associated with dormitory villages of people who actually continue to commute back because they continue to need to visit the urban area for work. If we unpick that and say, well, okay, they don't need to to work in the urban area, maybe they become more focused on life in a rural area. They engage more in the local community, and maybe they are more interested in local products of one sort or another. So next slide. And so the question then is, well, can we say anything about the responses? And so, well, okay, it follows that if we have new demands for infrastructure, broadband access in rural areas has been a hot political issue for a long time, and various governments have promised to get it done. Maybe there'll be a much stronger demand and political pressure to get this done, and maybe part of the leveling up would be actually providing infrastructure rather than just build, actually providing better infrastructure connectivity in rural areas. What are the implications for planning? So if we think about planning, and we've had really since the post-war a very strong focus on the containment of urban areas, that our planning system maybe potentially being dismantled by the current government, but has been focused very much on urban containment. So do we stick with that and force villages to continue to be densely settled, even though the population is increasing? Or do we accept that some of our green space, our green fields may be turned into development? Do we change the nature of the development? Do we look for larger properties? And then what about the implications for rural land policy? Does this give a boost for the demand for nature conservation, for public access? And then what about the demand for food? We could think about our local services perhaps as being agricultural production. So do we want to look to shorter supply chains where we consume products to a much greater extent that are produced within the local area? And we can think about whether that actually makes the system more resilient in the sense that we are closer, the supply chains are shorter and perhaps more reliable, but of course it may become less resilient in the sense that it becomes more vulnerable to a localized drought or frost or something that has a big impact within a local area. And actually we can make the system more resilient by trade, by exchanging products between different areas. And then a final thought is, well, we perhaps focus on the people who are moving, but what about the locals? On the whole, the pattern in rural areas tends to be that locals, people who live and work in local areas, have lower incomes. They can't compete in the housing market. People often moving out of urban areas have sold a house and can afford to pay more in the rural areas. What about unequal access to technology? What about the people who still travel for manual occupations? So that raises, I think, a variety of questions that are set out. Thank you, Stephen. Things we should think about. Well, what are the implications? Is my speculation pure nonsense, or is there actually something going on? Is this a long-term effect? And I guess in a policy sense, should we encourage or discourage this trend? And if we encourage or discourage, what ways? I guess the implication is we probably will need to mold it, and different places will have different opportunities. So we need to think about how this works out in a local context. What about the infrastructure requirements, planning policy, and implications for food and rural land and nature conservation and public access? So I'd like to discuss those sorts of things in our breakout session. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you very much. And at that point, I will stop sharing those slides. We'll move very swiftly on now to the breakout sessions, which will be led by each of our speakers, and each is supported by a reporter who will help put together the summary that will come back to the main group in about 25 minutes or so. Now, if the magic of the IT works, and at this point I look to my technical colleagues, every person should have been randomly assigned to a group, and fairly soon at the press of a button, you should find yourselves being whisked off to one of 4 breakouts. That appears to be working, thank you. Right, we are running a little bit behind, and therefore I'm going to ask for the next session for sort of 2 things to happen in quick succession. First of all, I'd like each of the reporters to give us a very quick summary of what sort of 1 or 2 key points that came out of each of the groups. It only needs to be, you know, what were the most exciting bits were, and then immediately I will ask each of the panelists to reflect on what they've heard from the reporters, and really just focus on almost one question that they can make a final point on. And it's really, I think, try to seize on this as an opportunity rather than all the doom and gloom we see around COVID. Is the driver of COVID something that we can turn into something opportunistic to see something happen, beneficial change happen at a much faster pace for the economy or society, rather than just thinking that it's a negative thing? Can we use this as an excuse to do something that really does drive up our abilities around, say, resilience for the future based on the current experience? What is the big opportunity? And I just wonder if each of the panelists, after they've heard the feedback, could tell us where they think that big opportunity lies. As a bit of a quick, challenging ask at the last minute, which I didn't prepare them for, but I'm sure they'll be up for it. So perhaps we can hear from the reporters. Shall we just start in the order we went before, and therefore whoever's reported on Ajith's group, perhaps if they could share with us.
Thank you, Stephen. That would be me. So we talked about predominantly from an infrastructure and resilience perspective, where maybe the 2 key points would be that before the pandemic struck, or even right now, we sort of see that much of infrastructure or organizations are sort of in silos. So you will see that data or knowledge that you need to inform our responses for such pandemics or even crises are essentially in silos, are not coordinated. So we sort of thought about how we could capture and share knowledge going forward, which is super critical for us responding to such pandemics. And also sort of drawing on to your thought earlier as well. So how can we repurpose our responses later, or repurpose our life later? Can we sort of use this situation as a catalyst for change, sort of repurposing our infrastructure by not just thinking about it from a physical perspective, but also thinking about the services that it might provide. So we sort of had that talk on one of the Cardiff model, where they have opened up their streets to allow more cycling and walking, plus providing more spaces for the local businesses to get their customers seated outside. So can we repurpose it to allow more management and policy information around that functioning aspect? So that's what we essentially took out.
That's great, Manu. Thanks very much for that. So from Michael's group, and Carl, who was commenting on that one?
And that would be me. So our question was that how will the growth of telemedicine and remote monitoring service following the COVID will impact the health service delivery and hospital design? So we started really focusing around communities and understanding that besides the hospitals, a lot of the healthcare is delivered in communities. So are we focusing on that? And as we explored that question, something that came up was around who, from a patient's perspective, who needs the care typically, and if it's the old and the young, then they may not be very digitally equipped. So there were concerns raised around the digital divide and that social exclusion based off of that. So the service we're providing, the beneficiaries may not be able to actually receive that with the technology. Some other things we talked about were around resilience and how building resilience and post the pandemic, there's an opportunity to learn from other sectors. And one of the examples that came up was around how supermarkets are really quick and have established supply chains to get products quickly into the markets, but we may have a challenge on the healthcare side in terms of getting supplies, PPE, for example, medicines, and a potential issue with vaccinations in the future as well, in terms of how we distribute that. a couple of other things we discussed were around just the cultural and behavioral differences and the impact of that, and the impact of providing telemedicine or healthcare digitally, and how cultural and behavioral differences may play a part in terms of a patient expecting to receive the care in person, or allowing the physicians to address an ailment, but not just ailment, but for the maintenance of health. So there was a philosophical question around maintaining health versus treating an ailment. So I think those would be the key things that we discussed.
That's excellent, Mansur. Thanks very much for that. And Tamaya, Sam, you are our feedbacker.
Thank you, Stephen. So we started off talking about how energy use has been affected post-COVID, and how we've seen more of a decentralization within the energy network, both in terms of how the energy companies actually operate, how their employees operate, how their data is operating, but also in terms of how we've moved, with more people working from home, we've moved away from very concentrated high energy demand in the centers of cities towards unexpected increased demand in places where energy companies maybe didn't expect it before, where more people are working from home, and how that sudden change highlights a sort of lack of resilience in some parts of the energy system. But that's not a new problem, because in some cases where there have been upcoming changes to local needs for energy, maybe related to transport, for example, there was already sort of a problem on the horizon, which now COVID has accelerated. So that's something that energy companies need to react to. Also, very large changes in terms of how transport systems work. So where mass transport has obviously been quite important before, where cities have had, say, zoning plans where you have sort of residential areas of a city and then areas where people work, and there needs to be mass transit between those areas. And now there's suddenly a smaller number of people who need to still travel to work, but nowhere near the initial demand that there was before. And that's having negative impact on those transport providers. So that's a maybe more of a short-term plan if we don't expect that trend to continue post-COVID, but it's highlighting a lack of resilience in transport as well. So then that led us on to talk about how planning practices in general don't have, maybe they're not hugely robust to change, such as we've seen post-COVID, and how there may be a requirement going forward to sort of revisit some of the urban models that people use when designing cities, to take into account that sort of potential for change. And partly that's, I suppose, because in the past, development has been sort of quite neoliberal and developer-led in terms of the ideas of value, where you should build. Is there really a need for green space, or do you just want to cram loads of apartments into a space? And maybe that was not the most long-term perspective, looking back on the kind of priorities that those developers had at the time. So maybe that will lead to some change. And lastly, we looked at sort of an increase in data and sort of smartification, and how that could be used to make better decisions going forward about planning. And we sort of ended thinking about, do we expect sort of smarter users with this increase in data? Do we expect the users to use the data, or do we expect the designers to use the data? And that led us on to talk about the changing skill set of infrastructure and planning professionals. And then the last point was this question of, does COVID disrupt trends that are already sort of pre-existing? For example, for a long time, car use was declining in cities, but now we've seen that reverse during COVID, because there's a greater demand for people to use their cars, reduced demand for them to use public transport. Does it disrupt existing trends, that drop in car usage, or does it encourage existing trends? For example, the move towards working from home, which was already a pre-existing trend before COVID. And perhaps where it's encouraging existing trends to move forward more rapidly, those will be more sustainable changes. Perhaps where it's disrupting existing changes, we can expect that to bounce back a bit more. But either way, it's showing that some of the assumptions we had clearly aren't quite as set in stone.
No, that's great. Thanks, Sam, very much. And finally, from Ian's group, we had, I believe, Nabil, yes, you were helping out there. I'll ask you to be pretty concise.
Okay. So we had a fairly wide-ranging discussion, but one of the basic questions is whether the situation that we find ourselves in at the moment is going to be a long-term one, and what the impact of that is going to be on the rural economy. Is this going to mean, with the exodus of people from the cities, is there going to be a rebalancing of population between the cities and the countryside? And some thoughts on this was that not necessarily as massive a rebalancing as one might think, and that we maybe need to think about the way in which we redesign the way cities are used, and how they're repurposed, particularly in relation to buildings that might be liberated. The other point that we sort of discussed was that even given that COVID has actually thrown a lens on what is problematic and has highlighted trends that we might like to see developed within our society. Whether these changes will occur or not, we think is a highly political issue and requires the use of power, essentially, to effect change. We're not very optimistic that the current leadership of our country is actually would think along progressive lines, and that perhaps the best way to bring about change is, in fact, a decentralization of economic and political power. And I think we're beginning to see increasing demands for this. Another point that was brought up was that when we're thinking about the problems that COVID, talking about COVID, but there will be other pandemics given this interconnected world. Another issue that was brought up in relation to potential solutions to the problems that this pandemic has highlighted was to think about the context of the pandemic. In other words, the economic and cultural context will require different solutions, so that the point was made that when we look at emerging economies and developing economies, the pandemic is not necessarily the major priority. And so we're looking at it very much from a developed, industrialized and integrated economy. But those solutions are not necessarily applicable to all parts of the world. So these were just some of the points.
No, and that's actually, that last one is something we haven't really talked much about at all tonight, but it's an incredibly important perspective, because this is a global thing. That's why it's called a pandemic, and we are looking at it perhaps from a little bit from our little developed world bubble. Can I move us then very quickly on to the thing I've just prepared the four speakers to give their final thoughts on, which is if each could perhaps just say what is potentially the big opportunity, the area where the most change that could help us for the future could come from now, just in there, just do your best with a quick thought so we can have something to take home with us. Perhaps we'll go in the same order as ever. Perhaps we'll go, yes, with Ajit first.
Yeah. Okay. It came up in our discussions and came up in the report back as well, and across the different themes, is what we probably need to really do is to really diverse ourselves from thinking about the infrastructure as just the physical thing, and think more carefully about the fact that, well, we do understand this, but think carefully about the fact that the infrastructure exists to provide a service, and really understand the service and the outcomes. When we are thinking about designing infrastructure or changing our infrastructure, always think about the outcomes that the infrastructure is intended to provide, and think about how the nature of the outcomes might change in the future. When we do scenario analysis, stop thinking about the engineered system, stop thinking about the width of the road and the capacity of the road, and think about getting people from A to B. And if we start thinking really carefully about the outcomes and how the outcomes might change as a result of this pandemic, and design flexibly and adaptably to meet the outcomes and the needs of the end consumers, then I think we will be in a better place, rather than just thinking about the piece of road that we are building.
So longer term needs as the starting point, rather than the solutions as the starting point.
Yeah.
Michael.
Well, I'm going to follow on by saying not just a bit of road and not just a bit of technology. Indeed, as let's pick up from Nabil's point there, the whole idea of how can we move forward? I think the idea of taking the resilience which we've seen often demonstrated with quite a lot of creativity in the pandemic, for it to be maintained where appropriate and leveraged in new ways really requires thinking through the intersection of this resilience with decentralization. And I think the wider context of whether that might happen, funding, politics is crucial. But I think also positively, the way in which, if you take certain countries, developing country contexts, where perhaps there is a lot of lessons and knowledge that we can also glean from in terms of, say, pandemics and how they've been dealing with challenges similar in some ways, though different, for many years. So to look beyond our shores to where knowledge is most helpful and across the world, and interconnect for us all being able to be globally more resilient.
Wonderful, thank you. And Timea.
Yeah, so I think I will be very brief, and I just wanted to refer back to potentially the very beginning of my presentation. So it might be a bit of a wishful thinking only, but hopefully not. But I think that I still uphold that most of the issues that COVID-19 highlighted relate to actually unsustainable processes, and so I do think that in dealing with the impacts of COVID-19, we will be able to learn something about potentially how to do and what to do about climate change and mitigating climate change or producing climate change responses that can help with mitigation and adaptation as well.
So in a way, COVID has helped flush out some of the worst of our current practices in many ways.
Yeah, I guess it highlighted how these practices actually are impacting everyday lives of people in negative ways, and that will be very, very helpful in justifying why we need to change change things that impact everyday practices, but actually those changes will be for the better of everyone.
Which would be a good outcome overall. And finally, Ian.
Okay, thank you. Well, the co-discussants weren't necessarily encouraging us to think positively, but I'll do my best. That maybe we can think about the creative destruction of centralized control and centralized governance. That actually what we're finding in the pandemic is actually the inability of centralized organizations to actually deliver what we need in particular places in particular ways. And that might lead us to actually, it might be the sufficient motivation to decentralize power so that we can focus much more at a local community level. And at that level, we can begin to focus more at that scale on what it is we value and have more scope to control the mechanisms that enable us to deliver them.
That's it. That's your manifesto. That sounds wonderful.
That's it. I thought an uplifting, I hope.
You've turned what I thought you were going to say something negative, and now you've turned it into something remarkably powerful and positive, which I suspect many of us feel frustration and so forth at the moment. But there we are. I would like just to offer anybody else who's still on the call the chance to make any final comments or raise anything that they feel that they're burning to share with all of us.
I'll add one more positive thing, Stephen. I think from our experience in the healthcare sector and looking at some of the services that have been developed, COVID's offered an opportunity to drive through change that is would ordinarily have taken many years to get done in the healthcare service. And so there are opportunities here that we can find space for innovation and drive change more long term.
Yeah, and the pace of innovation, it's certainly been proven, the pace of innovation can be accelerated dramatically if you really need to. So yes, again, we are seeing some quite inspiring things in some places. Okay, we have run out of time. So I would just like to say a very big thank you to those of you who turned up this evening virtually, particularly to the panelists for the time and they put in for the preparation and talking to us, and to the reporters who have collated our thoughts and fed back. I would just once more draw your attention to the fact that this is one of a series, and that next week on the 5th of November, might go off with a bit of a bang, we have the, if I get this wrong, Nabil will shoot me, I think it's the law and governance impacts of COVID next week, and following that, the week after that, or it might be the week after that even, we get into education, but that's further down. All of this is being sold online at our website, so you can easily find out about future events. I say thank you for coming along this evening. I don't think there's anything more to be said. I think it's good night from me and from all of us here at Hughes Hall. Thank you very much.